It really is a pleasure to introduce this event today. My name is Molly Brunson. I am faculty director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program, which also houses the Central Asia Initiative here at the MacMillan Center. I'm also faculty here at Yale in the departments of Slavic and Art History, and it is a distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the MacMillan Center and to our annual George Herbert Walker Jr. Lecture, to be given today by journalist and author Peter Pomerantsev. This lecture features speakers and topics of global significance. Previous speakers have included former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and former US Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Carla Hills. And they are in very good company today by our speaker, Peter Pomerantsev. Tonight's lecture is the first of 4 signature MacMillan events over the course of this fall, in addition to the hundreds of events hosted by our 7 regional councils and programs. And we do encourage you to visit our website for a full accounting of all of the events here at the MacMillan Center over this academic year. After the lecture today, we'll have time for a short Q&A. And it will also be followed by a light reception upstairs in the second floor common room. And we do invite you all to join us at this reception after the lecture. As an administrator responsible for this event, I remind you that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with a speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy. I want to make one other announcement, and that is that the event today will be recorded so that you're aware. So let me introduce our speaker. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of the digital era of disinformation and polarization. Before this, he was a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he's also been a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. As an expert on media and propaganda, Peter has testified before the US Senate and Congress, as well as the UK Parliament, and he's regularly called on to lead seminars and write policy recommendations for both national governments and NGOs, including the UK Foreign Office's strategic communication policies for Russia and the Western Balkans. Personally, I first heard about Peter about a decade ago, when after a lecture on Soviet art, an especially precocious undergraduate came up to me with a just read and much dog-eared copy of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. This particular student raved about how relevant this book felt, both to what we had been studying in that course, but also to our own moment, a moment that was on the eve of the 2016 election, a moment when fake news had just entered our public discourse. What Peter described in this book as a reality show Russia, which blurred the line between fact and fiction in public and political life, this has, if anything, become all the more relevant in the decades since its publication. For its insights and its lively prose, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize and was nominated for the Samuel Johnson, Guardian First Book, Pushkin House, and Gordon Burns Prizes. It has been translated into over a dozen languages and was dramatized on BBC Radio 4. Since then, Peter has gone on to publish This Is Not Propaganda, which was shortlisted for the Gordon Burns Prize and was a Times Book of the Year. And just last year, How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Writing about this most recent book, the reviewer for the Times Literary Supplement calls Peter, and here I'm quoting, our Virgil through the inferno of information warfare, and deems the book both a history and a rallying cry. So it is this ability to combine deep regional knowledge about media and politics with a broader horizon toward the challenges of information and disinformation for the modern age that makes Peter Pomerantsev such a fitting guest here today at the MacMillan Center. So with that, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. When I was sort of trying to work out how to tailor my talk today, I was asking sort of colleagues about what sort of crowd comes to here, and I was told it's people who are very nerdy about Eastern European regional issues. So I put a bit of that in. There's some fresh polling from what Russians think about the war in there. Then I said I was told there's a lot of sort of people like more literary types, more humanities. So there's a lot here about World War II pornography for the more kind of like liberal arts inclined. And thirdly, I was told to be kind of relevant as well. So I'm actually not going to mention America once in this talk. I'll leave it to your imaginations. I'm at Johns Hopkins these days. I still write books, which I consider my main line of activity. But when the war the full-scale invasion started, I helped co-found a war crimes NGO called the Reckoning Project. Actually, a member of the board is here, I think. It's co-founded with Janine DiGiovanni, who's a fellow at the MacMillan Center. And essentially what we do is we gather evidence about war crimes, and then we have a team of lawyers who build cases, do submissions to the UN, and we have kind of a team of journalists who write stories. So it's kind of putting legal work and communication together. And I think it's an important intro to the theme of my talk today, which is actually about how you reach audiences, in this case in Russia, who don't want to listen to what you have to say. But there's going to be some gruesome images. So it's been a fairly gruesome few years. But, as you know, after the war sort of began, many Ukrainians were calling sort of relatives and friends in Russia and telling them about the horrific things that were happening. This was very common in the first part of the war. And they'd hear bizarre replies back, you're making this up, or you're bombing yourselves, or just denying the reality of what was going on. And I remember talking to friends in Kharkiv, and they were calling their relatives literally under bombardment, and their relatives were saying, oh, there's some sort of mistake, you don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, no, we're literally sitting here under bombardment. So this really quite violent denial of reality. We could think of many reasons for it. But for us at the Reckoning Project, it was a real challenge. How do you, if we're in the business of creating media and we want to communicate to audiences across the world about the war crimes being committed, how do we do that? Yeah, and frankly, even we sort of started to give up at one point. I remember going to see President Zelensky right at the start of the war, and he was in despair. At the end of the day, he was a communicator, a comedian. He'd had primetime shows on Russian television very recently, a little bit too recently for many people. And he thought he knew the Russian audiences, and he found that he couldn't reach them, couldn't talk to them. He was calling his old friends from the Russian entertainment industry, and they were like just denying the reality of what was going on. And there was one event that really, really struck me. This is a picture from Yakidne, a village in the Chernihiv region, where our team of researchers came very, very early on, just after it had been liberated, and really collected stunning testimonies about a whole village. This is just after their liberation, that had been imprisoned in a cellar for a whole month, basically, of the occupation. Really powerful testimonies of a very, very brutal and murderous period. They were denied food and water, and some were shot just for entertainment. And I kept on asking the people here, well, how did you talk to the Russian soldiers? Yeah? What did they think they were doing there? You saw them for a month. You talked to them continuously. And they said, well, they gave us the official propaganda lines most of the time. We're here to liberate you. We're here to save you from the Nazis. We're here to allow you to speak Russian. And the people there were sort of saying, but hold on, you can see that we speak Russian. You know, we have no problems here. Nobody asked you to come here. Nobody wanted you here. And the soldiers would keep on repeating these lines, even though they could tell they weren't true. And at the back of the sort of cellar where they'd been held, I found this sort of box, which those of you who can read Russian, it says «Комплект по военно-политической подготовке». So a kind of like, you know, a sort of stuff, I don't know, комплект, a collection for military political preparation. So propaganda materials. So it was a box of propaganda materials, largely empty by the time I came across it, but there were some sort of like screwed up bits of newspaper there, yeah? And these were the kind of newspapers that were given to the soldiers by their political commissars, I suppose, new version of political commissars, telling them what propaganda lines to kind of say and repeat. I mean, they're newspapers. And you know, they're talking about how horribly murderous and brutal and war crimes inclined the Ukrainian regime is. And they use the language of fact-checking. This is a page of fact-checks calling out the lies of Western media. So essentially sort of the sort of, you know, a kind of Snopes, but directed by the Kremlin. I mean, some of the things we've actually researched in great detail at the Reckoning Project. So they're saying it's a fake that Russia bombed a maternity hospital. If anybody want to come and talk to me afterwards, we just released a huge report identifying the propaganda around this event. But I was just fascinated about the soldiers. I mean, they were getting this propaganda. They were told to repeat it. They could see reality was completely different. And they existed in this cognitive dissonance. When I talk to some of the victims of some of the most brutal incidents there, I kind of asked them, so do you feel that the soldiers were ideologized, they'd been brainwashed into their brutality? And their sense was the opposite, actually, that it was an excuse for them to commit the sadism they wanted to commit, the ones who were particularly heinous. Yeah? So not so much that they were believing the propaganda and somnambulating into committing horrific deeds. They wanted to commit the horrific deeds, and the propaganda was just a useful excuse. So this puzzle of how you reach audiences that don't want to listen, that are maybe using the propaganda to, I don't know, to articulate their most heinous desires, is something that, you know, something that keeps me up at night as someone who specializes not just in trying to work out how you stop authoritarian propaganda undermining democracies, but also how do we go on the offensive? How do we reach audiences in countries like Russia? You know, I'm giving here some of the sort of quotes that Russian propaganda over the past 3-4 years is repeating on television about Ukraine. I'm going from the kind of the mild stuff, which is Surkov, who was kind of the hero of my first book. He used to be in charge of Russian propaganda, then he messed up the invasion, and now he's under house arrest in Barvika. But, you know, he's a bit of an intellectual, so he would say something like, oh, there is no Ukraine, there is Ukrainianism, that is a specific disorder of the mind. That's kind of on the pseudo-intellectually side of things. Then Solovyov, who's a Russian TV presenter, very, very popular, arguing that Russia needs to deworm Ukraine of any hopes for independence. Ukrainians need to be cleansed, undergo re-education through pro-Russian media so their heads would be put back in place. And then kind of at the more radical end, you have Markan, who has a state-supported sort of podcast and radio program. He's much more on the kind of radical side. So Ukrainianness as a system must be completely eradicated in the liberated territories, full and total de-Ukrainization. And people who identify themselves as patriots of this chimera are degenerates, interesting word. People who fight for it are criminals, they are no longer humans. So, you know, that's a sort of a small sampling of the sort of propaganda that's been pushed out in Russia since the start of the war. So I wanted to understand more about, how do Russians feel about the war, and what's fueling their seeming support for it, yeah? Because if you were looking at the sort of polling at the start of the war, the support for the war was very, very high. Were there any cracks in that support? If we could start thinking about reaching out to bits of society, which ones you would do that to? And so I joined forces with a couple of real academics. I'm one of these sort of like weird fellows, where I'm not, I have a PhD, but it's in literature, so it's not really a PhD. But like real social scientists. So Maria Snegovaya at Georgetown and Graham Robertson at Chapel Hill, who any Russia experts here will be very familiar with. And we really wanted to get into this issue, yeah? Why are Russians so supportive of the war? Are they as supportive as they may seem? Does this propaganda work? This very aggressive, expansionist, one might even say genocidal rhetoric. So what really interested us was the question of what is the role of identity, yeah? And Russia's perceptions of themselves during wars. And one thing that we pulled out straight away, that sort of high support for the war doesn't start in 2022. It was actually already there in 2008 during the invasion of Georgia, 2015 in Syria, yeah? You have 69% opposing direct military assistance to the Syrian president, and by early October 2015, after it's happened, 72% supported. In December 2021, 8% of Russians thought Russia should send military troops to fight against the Ukrainian government. By 2022, it's up to 80%. Yeah? So every time a war starts, people really get behind it. And what a lot of social scientists identify is the connection between identity and support for the war. Yeah, quite a few social scientists, like the very famous Gutkov, talk about how support for these military adventures is correlated with something they call collective narcissism. So that's not just sort of patriotism, that's the sense that your culture and society is picked on by others, that it's a victim of others, and that's also that it's superior to others. So this mix of victimhood and superiority. And we wanted to sort of test that hypothesis. So we went on a very long journey of trying to do some polling inside of Russia, as every polling company got more and more pressure put onto it. So at the start, it didn't seem to be a problem to be polling in Russia. By the time we actually launched, we were having to do it through very, very friendly Ukrainians who found a marketing company. And I can't tell anybody else precisely what they did because it would put somebody in danger. It got very, very difficult just to do this in terms of the technology of it. But the questions we were looking at were, is support from the war going to correlate with media, what sort of media people followed, and these issues around identity. So around patriotism, nationalism, here's some of the questions that we asked. To what extent are you proud of Russia's achievements? Is it better for me to be a citizen of Russia than of any other country in the world? I'm glad that I'm Russian. I will only be satisfied when we Russians receive the recognition we deserve. And the strength of identification with Russia is important. So this is how our polling broke down. I'm not the social scientist, but put it this way, Graham and Masha are very serious social scientists. I got lost at one point with the methodology. I've never seen anything so rigorous in my life. They had telephone and internet, double checking the internet with the telephone. I've done a lot of polling with marketing companies for bits of research I've done. I would have done around 20 polls in this period. It took them to do one poll, but they then repeated it. They've submitted it to very, very high-level journals. So just believe me that these results are fairly solid. If Graham and Maria are happy with them, I'm happy with them. I'm used to doing much, much quicker and dirtier stuff. But anyway, what it broke down to was, I don't think this is the best order to do it in. Let's do it this way. So, the biggest cluster that we have were what we called active supporters, yeah? That's around over half the populations. This is an AI-generated image of an active supporter. We put this data in, and that's the image that it gave us. That isn't our art. I think AI is pretty good. Those of you who follow sort of like what's going on in the Russian Duma have definitely had to listen to speeches by this person. I can even sort of imagine their breath, that like very unique combination of cologne, vodka, and actually very expensive pate. They are very high on the scale of collective narcissism. They very much believe that Russia is greater than others, that it's a victim of others, that it needs to dominate others. I don't know how much this means to non-Russia specialists, but they're very into the blogs of Nikita Mikhalkov, who's a person and a sort of cultural figure, shall we say, tend to come from a little bit more likely to come from the provinces than the big cities, but that is actually less of a decider than we thought. Then there's a big group of what we called loyalists. They're proud to be Russian, but a bit less on the collective narcissism. So they don't think Russia is necessarily better than others. They're just very proud of it. They are a little bit more varied in their media. They don't just listen to state media. Tend to be middle-aged. But the thing to know about them, they're very conformist. Yeah, they're the people. If you give them a scale of questions, do you feel strongly? They'll always put themselves in the middle. They're the most likely people to say, I don't know, to a question, which they're the people who keep their heads underneath the parapet. And again, slightly misogynistic use of AI. That's just us. And then there's the critics, the 11%. So these are the people who are ready to listen to our journalism and who we do our journalism for when we do journalism in Russia, to what's going on in Ukraine. They're the most likely to be critical of Russia. They're the ones who follow TV Rain, and they're the most likely to have left the country. Going back to this slide, I mean, just to really sort of nail the kind of like this sort of this cluster of things that go together. Active supporters are, their belief that Russia is superior to others is way higher than anybody else's. And again, remember, that's over half the population. Yeah? We're not asking them any questions here about, is the war good or bad? We're not doing anything dangerous in these questions. We're not putting them, we're very careful not to ask people anything that would feel super political. It's just questions about how you feel about Russia and so on. And then they're the ones who are most using Russian state media the most as well. So anyway, then my colleagues, and they're brilliant, I have absolutely no idea really how these things work in a scientific way, but they wanted to sort of test this idea that these issues to do with Russian collective narcissism had a connection with how people felt about the war. And so what they did is they gave people two questions. Yeah? One saying, Vladimir Putin has said, which he has said in the past, we need to stop the operation, look for peace, or we need to sue for peace. And the other one where Putin has said, we need to continue war. Putin has said both these things. Neither of these things are dangerous things to say. We were very, very clear. Neither of these statements are dangerous to agree with. Yeah? They're both Putin statements. Yeah? And essentially what my colleagues did is show the questions, essentially prime people, or some of the people, yeah, with questions around identity and collective identity, and is Russia superior to others? Some of the ones didn't get those questions, some did, yeah? And basically, cut a long story short, if you had been exposed to any questions or discussions around is Russia superior to others beforehand, you are significantly more likely to say that the war should continue. Yeah? So basically, it's a tiny little, tweak of an experiment, but there does seem to be a pattern between supporting the war and exposure to propaganda about Russia being a victim and superior. Lots of people agree with that anyway, but it seems from this the little thing my colleagues tried, that there is a connection between it. So listen, this is all the work of Maria and Graham, really, because I'm just interested as somebody who's worked with media all their lives, even though now I kind of like hide away in the reclusive shrubbery of academia. As was clear from the introduction, I still work a lot with a lot of foundations, a lot of media who are thinking about or trying different ways of competing with authoritarian propaganda, not just in Russia, all over the world, but in Russia too. But the question remains, given everything we know, given that only 12% of Russians are open to listening to any of the facts about the war, how on earth do we approach undermining their confidence in the war? Because when Ukrainians were calling their relatives, it wasn't just to inform them. It was to get them to stop the war. It was to cause outrage or some sort of reaction to stop the war. And the challenge that I face and my colleagues face is not just to communicate things for the sake of communicating it, it's to communicate what's going on in the war in order to try to have some sort of effect in stopping it. And kind of in my desperation, really, and in my confusion, I started turning to history. I started to think, what other examples are there in the past of trying to create, forget journalism by this point, information campaigns, communication exercises, counter-propaganda. They don't actually care what we call it, strategic communications. Anything that would have some sort of dent in this issue. Yeah? Which is how I started to come across Denis Sefton-Delmer, who also happens to be the subject of my last book. Okay. Let's be honest. What I'm doing here is fusing current research with my latest book. So we're now moving into the book to the book part of my talk, but then I'll tie it all together in a very, very clever way. So Sefton-Delmer was a British tabloid journalist who had grown up in Germany, knew Germany very, very well, and then during the Second World War becomes the head of special operations for the British Political Warfare Executive, which is essentially the propaganda organ of Britain during the war. It's the PWE is doing, it oversees the BBC's foreign work into Germany and into occupied Europe, and at the same time launching much more subversive campaigns into Germany to try to undermine German support for the war. And I was fascinated by Sefton-Delmer because he kind of faced a lot of the same challenges that I felt that we face today. Yeah? He was very frustrated with all the attempts of liberal exiled German media to communicate with Germans. He was very frustrated with the attempts of the BBC German service to communicate with Germans. He felt that the BBC German service was Maida Vale talking to Hampstead. That's 2 areas of London. So it's basically one bunch of emigres talking with another bunch of emigres. It's not reaching into the support inside Germany. At the same time, there was a lot of agreement with him in the British kind of media classes who felt that Britain was losing the war of the wavelengths, that Goebbels' radio inside Germany was so much more successful than anything that the British were doing to respond. And when I started looking at sort of Delmer's analysis, firstly of why Nazi propaganda was so successful, I found a lot of echoes with the challenges that we face today. Now, huge caveat here, not comparing, not saying that Nazi propaganda is the same as Russian propaganda. Nazi propaganda exists in its own category of evil, we all know that. We have lots of historical strites around that, and I don't want to get into those. But the underlying patterns that Delmer identifies in Nazi propaganda, but he also writes about German propaganda at the time of the First World War. He talks about British propaganda at the time of the First World War. He talks about Soviet propaganda. He basically sees them all as playing on the same psychological needs that so much of Russian propaganda seems to be playing on today. And just to sort of whip through them very quickly, firstly, not just belief in a leader. Delmer was fascinated by his visits to Nazi rallies, where he saw not so much a cult of the leader, but something else, the leader allowing Germans to normalize their most aggressive, unpleasant, and sometimes sadistic impulses. Yeah? Not that they were worshipping Hitler, but quite the opposite. Hitler's own narcissism, his own furies, his own ecstasies allowed people to be that way themselves. Yeah? The normalization of the worst in us, which reminded me a lot of what I'd heard in Yakodne, where the soldiers, didn't matter whether propaganda was true or not, it was creating a legitimizing structure to allow you to indulge in the worst of yourself. Secondly, again, so many people have written about this, Ian Kershaw, that the main sort of project of the Nazis was creating the idea of the folk, a group identity that was meant to smooth differences in German society, but most of all was to make up for the chaos of the Weimar era. So I heard you referenced my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, where I also try to describe the sort of the cabaret-like chaos of Russia in the early 2000s, and there were obvious parallels with Putin's attempt to create a great Russian identity with the German creation of the folk, a group identity that people enjoyed being part of. And maybe the most interesting part of Delmer's analysis of why Nazi propaganda was so strong and how he might think about undermining it is something which I don't think that others have written about. So the other two things, the identification of the leader, the group identity, are much observed. The third one is more curious and seems to me much more contemporary. Delmer essentially saw Nazi propaganda as giving people's roles that they could play in their daily lives. Yeah? It gave them a language to use. It gave them a uniform to wear. It gave them a way to structure their libidos, their sexual instincts. Yeah? I think Delmer would have been absolutely fascinated by social media today, the way social media gives you someone to be within a group. The Nazis had actually a very early form of social media that they used. They would give soldiers cameras, yeah, and a kind of diary with lots of spaces in it to stick photos from the cameras. And the soldiers were encouraged to take selfies of themselves as they conquered France, stick them in the diaries, and send home messages to their families. And these sort of early forms of Facebook were essentially then meant to be read communally. So they're already feeling their way towards the experience of social media. But that also gave Delmer a little clue about how to start thinking about undermining this system. Because in the sense that this was a game that people were playing, a performance that they were choosing to be part of. He didn't think they were brainwashed. He think people were enjoying being part of this performance. But that also meant you could potentially shift them towards another performance. So Delma was sort of tasked in 1941 to go and think about, given, this version of collective narcissism that was so popular in Germany, how would you go about undermining it? So I've actually got a little bit of a clip of him here, but I'm a bit worried that if I do the clip, we won't finish the lecture. So what I'm going to do is get to the end, and then if we have time at the end, we can listen to a little bit of Delma. Okay? So, to be very clear, when he...
Mr. Sefton Delma on the spot.
Okay, so there's just a little bit there. But we'll come back to that if you want to listen to him. So, what he comes up with, essentially, is a different philosophy that he thought would be able to reach people who are enjoying being part of this collective Nazi narcissism. The key kind of idea that he comes back to his bosses at the PWE is, we've got to stop trying to moralize to these people. Yeah, doing the sort of thing that we were trying to do at The Reckoning, or that the BBC German service was doing, telling them about the atrocious things the Nazi war machine is doing, telling them about the horrific crimes they're committing, telling them that democracy dies in darkness, telling them that fascism is evil, telling them that liberalism is superior. None of that is going to work. Yeah? That time has gone. Should have done that in 1932. By 1941, when he's working, it's over, he says. It's pointless. Yeah? You're just preaching to the converted. Throw all that out. And that is pretty much everything that the British are doing at that point. They're doing the German service at the BBC. They're also sponsoring a couple of social democrat left-wing radio stations, who are still hoping for social democratic revolution in Germany. He basically said, forget all that. And what he says he's going to focus on instead is what he calls the German pig dog, the Schweinehund. So instead of focusing on the positive things, the morality in the German character, he's going to focus on lust, jealousy, hatred, cowardice, and a lot of the own messages that the Nazis use back against themselves. And the first radio station that he launches is essentially, I don't know which of you guys follow the war here very closely, the war in Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but do you know who Prigozhin is? Everyone know Prigozhin? How many Prigozhin hands in here? Yeah, quite a lot of Prigozhin fans. Okay, so listen, the first radio station he launches is a far-right angry German soldier who's furious that the Nazis are too soft on bombing England, that they're pathetic, that actually they're full of Bolshevik spies. He's more right-wing in some ways than the Nazis themselves, but from the point of view of a soldier rather than a Nazi official. And his rants, his furies that he spouts at the Nazi elites are full of swear words. It's the language of the soldier, full of hate, full of viciousness. I mean, here's a little sample here, which you've probably read already, but it's all about how the SS are drinking while poor German soldiers are dying. Lots of references to pigs and penises, and not the BBC. Okay, this is not what the BBC is broadcasting at this time. No. And it gets much worse than that in terms of that. There's a lot of pornography on this radio station. Yeah. So if I'm leading towards the idea that we should use pornography to undermine Putin, yes. There's a lot of this stuff. The SS man Tienemann has a Polish lover at home who is personally in charge of the bamboo canes, twigs, thin and thick leather straps, and cat-o'-nine tails with which Tienemann and his guests are strafing her fat and large buttocks. The SS swine loves it when the naked woman's body whimpers back, cries and yells under the blows, and swears with the vilest words in the Polish language. And when she's properly whipped up to a purple color and whimpers and cries from pain, then the old impotent testicles are ready. And it goes on. So he's doing all this pornography. He's doing this kind of like, very, very virile, very sort of hate-filled laments about the life of German soldiers. And first I was a little bit confused about what his plan really was, you know? I mean, clearly he was doing something very, very different to what the BBC were. Clearly he's using this to kind of seed a fracture between the Nazi elites and the soldiers. That's all fairly basic. But as I went deeper and deeper into what Delmer was up to, I kind of started to divulge a set of principles which I think are curious to play with. So firstly, he was breaking the Nazis' monopoly on strong emotions. Yeah? He'd, going back to his experiences in Nazi rallies, seeing how the Nazis could legitimize the strongest and often most violent feelings that people had, his first step was say, no, we can do that too. Yeah? You don't have to go to the Nazis to look for your BDSM, hate, anger. You can come here as well. His second principle, which he talks about, is pushing Nazi propaganda one step further into the ridiculous. Yeah? So essentially using their own narratives against them. And instead of trying to talk about democracy and the awfulness of fascist crimes, it was use their propaganda against them to the point where it starts to undermine itself. Really, I don't want to make any pat comparisons with America at all, because that's careless. But I think we see it here with the Epstein files has been the most effective thing against Trump. Yeah? I'm not making any kind of qualitative comparisons between the various political forces involved, but that's just the case of somebody using their propaganda against them. And it's much more effective to fracture their coalition than any podcast series I've done at The Atlantic. Let's be honest. The third thing is he's always developing an alternative group identity. So Delmer's radio stations, and he starts with one, and they grow and grow and grow, and at the end he's actually managing dozens of them. They're always stressing the alternative group identity, replacing the folk with something else. So the identity of the army, the identity of the region, the identity of the church. He uses the church a lot. He has a whole radio station which is from led by a Catholic priest. Very obviously, but again, very hard to do well, he's speaking with local voices. He has POWs speaking on his shows, people who've come straight out of the German army and who speak with their slang and with their jokes and with their anecdotes. But perhaps the most interesting thing was this idea of the pig dog. So what is it, Delmer's basic idea, was that you need to provoke people to thinking about their own self-interest and not the collective interest. Yeah? What his whole radio project was actually always leaning towards was the collective narcissism, the collective highs and emotional satisfaction that you may get out of being part of the Nazi collective, the sense of superiority and victimhood and all these strange pleasures that seems to give. That's all very well, but it's not in your personal interest. Yeah? That ultimately, this collective interest, you're in a drama directed by the Nazi leadership, They're the ones writing the script. You are taking part in this performance where you get to play this role which seems pleasurable, but actually they're leading you to your destruction. But the question is, that's not, that's fair enough as a thought. But the idea was like, how do you get people to do that? If they are enraptured in this communal performance, if they are so enamored of the collective narcissism, how do you prick them into being individualists again? I think there's 2 or 3 things that Delmer is doing that I find kind of fascinating. So the first one is reminding people of their own self-interest in very counterintuitive ways. So his radio shows are full of stories about Nazi corruption. Yeah? But he's not wanting people to be outraged at corruption and stop it. His aim is to talk about how awful this corruption is, so that you go, well, hold on. Maybe I can be corrupt too. Maybe I can cheat on the German economy. Maybe I can sabotage my ship and not go and die in a submarine war. Maybe I can desert. Instead, he's reverse engineering what the Nazis were doing. Yeah? If they were creating legitimization structures, he too is creating, in a very subtle way, legitimization structures to let you be self-interested again. Yeah? He has lots of shows which seem outraged at the way German boats are being sabotaged by treacherous German sailors. How dare they, these awful people, they're going into their U-boats. Then he gives incredible detail about how you sabotage the U-boat. So the audience is meant to go away and go, well, maybe I should try that. But never forcing it on them, never pushing it on them. That would be way too blatant. So those are the psychological tricks that he's using. But maybe the most interesting thing that he's doing is thinking about how the medium, yeah, the actual way you communicate can stimulate self-interest, critical thinking. These things, in this case, seem very, very close. So when Delmer started his project, he tried to basically do a version of fake news. He created this character, this far-right German soldier who's angry at the Nazis, and Germans were meant to believe in him. And they do. For several months, the radio station is incredibly successful. Goebbels is freaking out about it. The diaries that we have surviving from the period show how many people are listening. Well, lots of people listen to it. The British are doing polling, by the way, of POWs, seeing how many of them are listening to these stations. Over half of German soldiers are listening to them. They're among the top 3 most popular stations in Germany. And so he creates this radio station, and it is found out there. Yeah, after 6 months, surprise, surprise, if you do a fake news disinformation operation, it's going to get caught pretty quickly. It'll get caught very quickly today, but it'll get very, very, it was also caught very, very quickly by the Germans. So it's blown, its cover is blown. And Delmer then kind of reinvents everything that he does. And he carries on creating stations which sound like Nazi stations. They have Nazi news and Nazi music, followed by completely subversive news from the front. So you'll have a Goebbels speech, followed by what's really happening. Part of that is for safety, yeah? So people can listen to it, knowing that it's the British. And if the Gestapo come, they say, I thought it was a Nazi station, sir, I had no idea. But much more than that, and he writes about it, and his colleagues write about it, they wanted to create something what you might call a sort of distancing effect. People were meant to listen to this, hear something like the Nazi news, and then when they heard something different, get a sense of distance from the Nazi news. Yeah? This is actually something that people in the German cabaret scene were fascinated by in the 1930s, and a lot of the people working with Delmer are German Jews from the cabaret scene who are playing a lot of these roles and helping him with the scripts. But he's sort of saying in a very subtle way to his audience, look, we can impersonate the Nazi news, yeah? And he can impersonate the music down to the ideal sound. It's almost like a Warhol that creates a copy. They took incredible care to make themselves sound just like the Nazi news, but you were meant to know the British were copying it. So the very idea, psychologically, that the British are copying it is already meant to make you go, hold on, how genuine is the original? And then you're meant to have all this hate and anger there, which is satisfying, even though you know it's the British who are allowing you to experience that. And at the end, you have this news from the front, which is giving you incredible detail about the lives of soldiers on the front. I can tell you later about how he got his data. So essentially, he was telling people, look, I can imitate the original. I can make you feel things, communal identity, violent emotions, as well as the original. And I understand your lives better than the original. Why do you need the original? So very quickly, to wrap up, because I have to finish quite soon, what can we learn from Delma? The negatives, I think his attempts to create kind of a fake news failed very quickly. Some of his techniques were deeply unsavory and were then actually taken up by the Soviets in their propaganda later on. But his understanding of audiences, his understanding of how you penetrate these collective identities, what seem to be like impenetrable environments, I think we can learn from a lot. So very quickly, because then I think we can have a discussion together about the relevance of this today, we followed up our polling in Russia with some questions. And this was me really tasking a team of Ukrainians that we were working with about, okay, tell me which themes will work among the active supporters. I know what works among the opposition. I can kind of guess what works among the conformists. I want to know, is there anything that we can say that will get under the skin of the people who are enjoying the invasion and who are very comfortable with genocide? And actually, the only thing that worked, the only one that worked, was the increase of crime in Russia as a consequence of the war. So, the fact that Ukrainians are dying, they don't care. The fact that Russian soldiers are dying, they don't care. No reaction to that. If anything, that made people more aggressive. If you show Russians videos that Russian soldiers are dying, stop the war, they become more aggressive. Yeah? It's the opposite effect. But if you start saying crime is going up, criminals are being released into the system, criminals and rapists are going to serve on the front and coming back home, that was the only thing we found that undermined, and we asked a very specific question, would you send your relatives to the war? Yeah? Which is much better than just do you support the war, which is a little bit too dangerous for people. So why? Why crime? And I'll go to the end already. Why crime? Again, this was a tiny little experiment. All we can do are tiny little things, in the field that I work in at the moment. I think it worked because it undermined this sense of collective superiority that Putin was trying to push. Yeah? These were very authoritarian people, very, very positive around Putin's strong hand, around the project of empire. The only thing that ever so slightly questions that is the idea that chaos is growing in the country and crime is going in the country. Yeah? That was the only thing that moved it a little bit. Look, this was a tiny little experimental piece of polling. Yeah? If we were to do this at scale, if we were to start thinking like a Delma today, how would we do it and with what aims? We can have a discussion about it, but I really see three reasons to try and think about it. Sadly, the stuff that I do with the Reckoning Project won't be important right now. However, we could think about increasing campaigns, engagement, targeted media that slow down the war machine and raise costs. So what would be the forms of communication that made recruitment to the army more expensive? What would undermine faith in the ruble? Secondly, there are very, very specific moments when the Russian system faces moments of chaos. The Prigozhin mutiny, the incursion into Kursk. At that moment, we see the Russian propaganda system freezing. At that moment, we see Putin's rating plummeting. At that moment, we see a moment of destabilization. And at that moment, some sort of communications campaigns, well-timed, could add to the sense of destabilization and undermine the Kremlin's sense of control over their society. And I think that's the main point that we have to think about if we even start to think about a framework for any of this enhance communication into Russia. This current regime is obsessed with its idea of control. Yeah? We can question where that comes from, where that comes from the start, their experience of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we see them very, very allergic to any signs that their control might be undermined in the economy, in their control over Putin's rating, in their control over narrative. We see how much effort they put into that process. So anything that starts to show them, yeah, that their own system of controlling attitudes, behaviors, acquiescence in Russia can be part of the factors that question their confidence about continuing to wage the war and could be part of the formula for them to take peace seriously. I mean, just to be very clear, Delmer thought none of his stuff worked if the military strategy wasn't there, if the economic warfare strategy wasn't there. All of these things have to go together, but that there is a small but significant role to play for communication as well. Oof. That's it.
We have a little bit of time for some Q&A, so if anyone has any questions, we have microphones on either side of the auditorium. Please raise your hand and we'll get one over to you.
I do realize I covered like a lot of things there very quickly. You're the first people to get exactly this talk, so like, thank you for being guinea pigs. You don't want to question the methodology?
All right. Here we go.
So some of the ideas that you had about kind of counter-propaganda as a means of kind of internal destabilization of Russia were really interesting. And kind of my question for you, kind of coming from my background, is when you develop a sort of tool like that, it inevitably gets used by a bad actor against yourself. So kind of how do you deal with the sort of ethical implications of that sort of issue?
No, that's a very important question. And that's kind of what happens to Delmer. I mean, after the Second World War, the people who most enthusiastically take up a lot of his techniques is the East German Secret Service, who absolutely love his autobiography, and it becomes essential reading for them. We're talking about ethics and propaganda, full stop, which is a thorny theme. I mean, some people would say that as long as your aim is ethical, then pretty much any means are fine. If you're stopping a genocidal war, it really, then that comes first. The question more is one of blowback. If you do that, do you ruin your own reputation in some way? Do you put people in danger? I think that's a very big issue. You could say that Delmer was following a principle of do no harm. By masking his anti-Nazi content in pro-Nazi wrapping, he was keeping Germans safe. So he was advocating a do no harm principle in his work. But look, these are all things that you start addressing at a point of deep, deep desperation. I mean, I turn to Delmer because there's no other way. It's at the moment when the public sphere is gone, when there is no space to communicate ideas and transform them into, policies and all that wonderful democratic idea of communication. At one point, that just goes, yeah? And all that you're left with, do you want to try something else, yeah? So there's a massive, we're talking about a situation of backs to the wall, and Delmer starts work in 1941, yeah, when all of Europe is under siege. So, but in the case of will it be done back to you? So because I had to do a truncated version of the history bit of my talk, so the Nazis started it, not just the war, but actually Goebbels was doing very much what Putin was doing today. He created a bunch of radio stations broadcasting into England, which were meant to sound like local English stations. There was one for the workers. It was a bunch of Cockneys POWs who were in Berlin, pretending that they were still in London and talking about how the wealthy British elites, Churchill and his gang of, and they would then give them all sort of anti-Semitic names, were abandoning the workers in London during the Blitz, and the workers should rise up. There was one for Scottish independence movement, Radio Caledonia, which was basically saying, this is not Scotland's war, we should stop the war. There was one for the posh aristocracy, which had sort of more posh people saying, the Germans are our Aryan brothers, why are we fighting them? Out of the three, only the posh one was popular because actually only the British aristocracy had a big pro-Nazi movement then. And the British were very worried about this. So Delmer is first asked to sort of think of something new when the Nazis had started it. So back to your question, look, Russia is doing non-stop campaigns into democracies without ceasing, increasing, and combining cyber, sabotage, the whole shebang. Our approach, we used to be what used to be the West, that thing. So the Biden and Schultz administration's approach, let's be very specific, was we're not going to do anything back because that would be escalatory. We don't want to send Putin any kind of signal that we want regime change. Because it felt regime, it's like maybe that would feel escalatory. The point was for Putin to calm down and stop. I understand that logic. I don't think it's crazy. I understand what they were trying to do. They had their own theory of change. I get it. It was rubbish. Yeah? My theory of change, and it's based on living in Russia, and I don't know, I suppose it's a very Eastern European hawkish view, is that Russia only stops when it feels pressure. At the start, that means many things. That means showing that we are producing enough arms in Europe. That means making sure the Ukrainian military has everything that it needs. It means, and we can go on, the economic warfare, probably blockading the Baltic Sea de facto, we won't call it that, but stopping the shadow fleet from leaving the Baltic Sea, putting sanctions on every port where Russian oil trades, and on top of that, the information component as well. The Putin regime is obsessed with domestic control. Until you start showing them that they don't have total control, they still have a lot of excuses not to stop. Yeah? So I do think it's not the ingredient, it's not a magic ingredient, sort of Wunderwaffe, but it's one of the many factors that if we were ever to get serious, we'd have to consider. Oh, suddenly questions.
Thank you. In your talk, you're presenting strategies for confronting a monolithic propaganda campaign. And in your book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, you talk about Putin's way of micromanaging information spaces to give the illusion of a kind of pluralistic system in which you would allow liberal or liberal slanted critics to have their voice, but very controlled. You would have the extreme right who would give them their voice, appropriate control, also within maybe the arts. But here, that's not a monolithic campaign. So did it turn into a monolithic campaign once the war started? Or how would you address the strategy of allowing a seemingly pluralistic system and that strategy versus having to go to a monolithic propaganda campaign?
Superb question. Absolutely superb question. One I was thinking about a lot as I wrote the book. Firstly, Nazis, less monolithic than we think. There was an SS publication that would go after the Gestapo media, and Delmer would be always playing between those tensions. So already then, Hitler had Goebbels, then he had, I've forgotten his name, the head of the press, I've forgotten his name, but he had several media managers who were constantly warring amongst themselves, just like Putin likes it as well. Evolution of the Russian media system since my first book, which is about what we now talk about the more vegetarian phase of Putin's regime, that was called managed democracy. That really ends in 2012, when Surkov is swiped away and you have more and more moves to a much more authoritarian system. Having said that, Putin is still playing different institutions off each other and different media off each other. Prigozhin was the best example. Prigozhin was there to keep the military in check. Prigozhin had his own media. And Prigozhin was meant to do that. That is both the strength of the system and the weakness, because it can spin out of control, as we saw with Prokogin. That's the kind of balancing act. Weirdly, that's the most sophisticated part of their propaganda, but also the most vulnerable one. Exactly. Secondly, there are moments when this pluralistic system collapses. So the incursion into Kursk was fascinating. So the Ukrainians move into Kursk, complete silence at the top. The mill bloggers, so there are these bloggers who are allowed to criticize the army. Yeah? Again, each mill blogger will be from a different security establishment, each criticizing each other's military structures in different ways. So it is sophisticated, but they all freeze, and then they don't know what to do, and they start writing stuff criticizing the Russian defense of the attack. It's one of the few times, where I was working with some OSINT experts who were following this. They then started deleting their own posts on Telegram. That pretty much means they got a call from someone saying, "What the fuck are you doing?" So it started to spin out of control. So there are moments, there are these exogenous shocks that happen when the system buckles. Now, what should have happened at the moment of the Kursk incursion? If we existed, the we that I keep on referencing but is gone, that would have been the moment to do secondary sanctions on China the same week. That would have been the moment to put sanctions on the fleet. That would have been the moment to expose Putin's best spies in Brussels. That would have been the moment to pile information pressure around this topic. Once Putin's rating has crashed, you've got something to play with. That, for that regime, is quite an important signifier. If they can't control that, that's a signal to them, oh, we can't control something, we need to start thinking seriously. Instead, what we did, or what happened, because there is no we to do this, the Kursk invasion happened, and then we basically gave the Kremlin all the time and space it wanted to reorganize themselves, sort themselves out, find a strategic message, which they did after 2 or 3 weeks. You could find, they searched desperately for ways to deal with this, and then they found one in the end. And then over time, just crush it. Going back into history as well, I just did a class on Monday at Hopkins about the evolution of the US propaganda, counter-propaganda system in the 40s and 50s. But there's this moment when the National Security Council says we have to do total Cold War. And that's their phrase. I don't know if they're sort of quoting Goebbels there. It's kind of a weird one to use. But, and that means the Marshall Plan. That means containment. That means rolling out Radio Free Europe, creating the US Information Agency, all at the same time. Yeah, these things work when they're done together at the same time and are then implemented in timed operations.
I think we have time for one more question. He had his hand up first.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Pomerantsev. I wanted to ask about the historical element of it and how it would relate to today, particularly regarding the anonymity of any means of communication. I mean, we're talking, of course, about an analog time, but Gustav Siegfried Fein's and Soldaten Center Calle were effective because both the enlisted German soldiers listening and the high command in Berlin believed these were internal. It was easy enough to spoof, from what I understand, the connections.
No, GS, so just to be, okay, it's a very good point. So what's the question, hold on, that you wouldn't be able to preserve anonymity now?
Well, my question is, would we be able to preserve that anonymity? I mean, because I'm thinking in terms of podcasts and stuff like that, people expect to see this people talking. So, and this is a good point to end on if it's all we have time for. So firstly, thank you firstly for knowing so much detail on this. Lovely to meet a fellow PWE nerd. But, so no, and this was the big discovery for me when I started digging into the Delmar archives. That's what I always thought as well. This was our bit of disinformation. Disinformation isn't actually that interesting. In the sense that you're just conning people. That's not psychologically very interesting. No, what's interesting is that the first one is created as a, what do you want to call it, a fake news radio? But it's busted very fast. And after that, when Delmar scales up his operation, and the later operations were much bigger than the first one, he wants Germans to know that it is the British cosplaying the Nazis. He definitely wants the high command to know, because the high command are meant to go nuts thinking, where on earth do they have so much detail? Which they do. They start making kind of arrests because they think there's a leak right from the top. No, the whole point is that, and this is what I found so fascinating, he's welcoming people into a masquerade. You know that we are cosplaying the Nazis. We know that you know that we're playing at the Nazis. Yeah? And in doing that, he's doing something so fascinating, which would be very easy to replicate today. He's bringing people almost through a series of psychological steps into a relationship. Yeah? If we think about different models of communication, is there really a difference, I suppose, between authoritarian communication and what we would like to think of democratic communication? And I don't mean communication in democracies. If you read a Goebbels, if you listen to a lot of propagandists in the West, people who do campaigns, they basically treat people like blank pieces of paper, yeah, like things they can mush and form. Russian propagandists talk about this all the time, yeah, that люди хавают, they'll eat it up. They are passive things that will eat up our propaganda. Goebbels was like this all the time. All I have to do is click my fingers and the German people will jump. But their model of communication is essentially that, wipe people down. Delmer is saying something else. He's saying there is a chance to start to welcome people into a relationship. And by welcoming them into a relationship, you can start to go, well, do you really need to be in that communal, weird march performance over there? Yeah? In that sense, just in that process, he's trying to get people to think for themselves and act for themselves, which was his aim. I think there's something a little bit democratic in that, even though Delmer would never say that what he did was democratic. Quite the opposite. His whole thing is like, I'm not going to preach democracy. I'm not going to give people any lectures on democracy. I think there's something, at least in terms of individualized critical thinking, that is there. Yeah? And weirdly, a communication between equals. The moment you're welcoming somebody into that relationship, you're talking to them as an equal. Today, that's much easier to do. Yeah, online tools let you do that. Yeah, there's all sorts of, digital engagement platforms out there that you could utilize for it. I mean, all the ingredients of what Delmer did are there. We just have to fuse them. There are very, very noble engagement media projects. Yeah, there's a very great faculty at CUNY, that even SUNY, whatever you call it, the City University of New York, that teaches about this. Yeah, this whole new wave of journalism. It's very, very moral. It's all about, let's welcome the audience into a communal relationship. Let's listen to what they say, their concerns. The journalist should ask them about which stories to do, should open, whatever. Making it a participatory process. But it's very, very, very moral and very, very dull, and in a good way. And then over there, we've got crazy stuff being experimented with AI and pornography. Delmer would be putting these together, and the tabloid stuff, and the rumors. That's what he would be doing. He'd be taking the sort of the democratic, dare we say, very small d democratic, tiniest d ever democratic potential of participatory media, and mixing it with something much, much more scurrilous and exciting. I actually think his treatment of pornography is very, very clever as well, but we just don't have the time to have the proper pornography discussion here.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you everyone for being here. Please give it up one more time.